Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for BOMA Standards of Measurement for Office Buildings. It is my pleasure to introduce Kelly Freiborg, Co-Managing Director of TWINSTEPS Architecture. Welcome, Kelly. Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning. So today we're going to be talking about measurement standards specifically for office space. Feel free if you have questions as I'm going through this presentation to interrupt me or message, and we can talk about things. There will be time for questions at the end of this as well. As I'm sure most of you know, there are several measurement standards within the BOMA catalog. So we're going to be focusing on office, but I'm happy to answer questions about any standard if you guys have them as we're going through this. So I'm going to go ahead and get started if that's all right with everybody.
Great.
I will take a silence as a yes also throughout this whole thing. So buckle up for that. Okay, so quick history for BOMA. As we all know, it's Building Owners and Managers Association. Footages have been issued from BOMA for many, many, many years. Since basically the early 1900s, we've had square footage standards. Most of them that we see in markets across the country, especially here in the US, are either the 96, the 2010, or the 2017 standard for office space. So we're going to be focusing on those as a baseline in this presentation. And then there are several other standards that relate to that. So outside of office space, there are now standards for industrial buildings, as well as gross areas of buildings. This is overall square footage measurement done for a single tenant very often, and including most of the area within a building. There's also a standard for residential buildings, retail buildings, and then mixed use is a standard that basically takes all of the other standards and allocates parts of a mixed use property to the other BOMA standards, if that makes sense. So how are BOMA footages used? Most of the time we see them in leases, right? These are used as a standard and agreed upon method for calculating office square footages as well as other types of space. They're not required, they're not legally needed, but what I like to explain to people is it's kind of like a building code. If you cite a specific BOMA standard in a lease, you're basically saying in one short little sentence, you've agreed upon roughly 130 pages of how you measured your building. So it knocks down a lot of questions for tenants, and it makes a really good standard for building owners looking at spaces. Okay, so a lot of people have questions about different terminologies that are used throughout the life of a building. Some of those are related to actual BOMA square footages, and some of those are related to constructability and International Building Code. So we're going to go over those really quick. Okay, so gross square footage, as you can see from the text here, that is the sum of all areas on a floor to the outside face of the constructed area of a building. This is used in the gross measurement standard. It can only be used if you have a single tenant building. If you happen to have a couple people in the building, you can't use the gross building standard unless you have a lease saying someone is subletting from somebody else. So that's a little bit of a tricky situation. So we don't see gross measurement standards a whole lot in actual leases for office space, but this is something that if you're developing a property and you're looking at the overall area of a building, gross measurement standard is a great way to roughly understand the size of your property very early on. FAR, floor area ratio. This is something that we see a lot, obviously, in the development of a property. This is the allowed area of a building by jurisdiction. So it actually depends on the state and the city that you're in. for what's allowed. But you can see here, this is what's allowed on a lot, roughly, for development of a building. So architects at the beginning of developing a property will look at this and figure out the best way to maximize a property and build on it. FAR is not a BOMA term at all. Construction gross area. This is another one that is not a BOMA term. This is used during the actual development of a building. So here you can see how that relates to a BOMA standard, both the gross area standard and the 96 BOMA, which is very closely related to the 2010 and the 2017 square footages. Interior gross area. So this is starting to get into what we measure for office properties. This is going to the inside line of a building and taking out, well, not quite yet, but eventually we're going to be taking out major vertical penetrations. But an IGA boundary, like you see at the end of this giant wall of text that we have here, is basically we're going to the inside face of glass or the inside face of wall, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail further on in the presentation. But this is the starting point for most of our office square footage measurements in a building. Rentable square footage. So this is a BOMA term. This is something that most people look for in a lease. This is the area of a total tenant space, including the load factor for the building. So that includes a floor load factor as well as a building load factor. And you're going to get your floor rentable area when you measure a building as soon as you take the IGA line less the major vertical penetrations. So that number that you get at the beginning of your spreadsheet will show up at the end again and should match. Leasable area. So this is something that is a little bit gray depending on who you're talking to. Very often this is rentable square footage, but sometimes it's not. So people have the ability to, as we all know, building owners have the ability to either go with a BOMA standard measurement if they want to, or to decide that a market load is appropriate. So if you have a building that is, you know, you might have an actual 25% load factor in your building, but the market can only sustain a 15% load factor. If you cap the load factor, that can still be a BOMA measurement, but it's listed as leasable area at that point. So if you're going through a space, the other thing that can happen is if you have a 10% load factor and you bump it up to a 12% load factor because that's market standard, that is not a BOMA allowed thing. So that would be leasable area, quote unquote, with a little bit less backing. It's not to say that you can't do that. There's just less potential justification for tenants in that building. And then usable square footage. This is the actual, roughly the space that is occupied by a tenant. It also includes the ancillary area for tenants. So this is anything that would be allocated to one tenant. It's either in their space or it's access to the space that is directly dedicated to that one group. Okay, so we're going to start at the beginning of whatever you might see on a lease, and that's the 96 standard. So the 1996 standard method for measurement, some of us have seen this, some of us have not seen this. It's very tiny. It's about 36 pages long, like you see there. It's all in black and white, and there were a lot of questions that came up because of that standard. So following the 1996 standard, there was an addendum that came out from BOMA that was 26 questions and answers, and that was to clarify the 1996 standard. and kind of delineate some more terms. And then the 2010 standard is much more defined than the 96. But the terms that you see in the 1996 standard are actually terms that everybody still uses that we don't see in later standards. So terms like usable square footage and rentable square footage are used most often in most markets across the country. And those actually only show up in the 1996 standard. So there are a lot of things that are defined in the 1996 standard. You can see here that a lot of those are terms that we still use. They have changed over time, but we keep referring to them, and that's fine. This is an example of what we actually see in the 96 standard for what's called out in a building. So the terms dominant portion and finished surface are still used quite a bit. Corridor, finished floor, etc. These are all things that we expect to see when we're talking about square footages. This is an example of the defined space on various different floors in the 96 standard. So there were some infographics that were helpful, but not necessarily for future use. Okay, so formulas in the 96 standard are still things that people refer to quite a bit. RU ratio is your rentable floor area divided by the floor usable area. People will ask about that very often. Rentable area, etc. These terms are used through following standards, even though you'll see that they change a little bit. The 96 standard still tends to be what people use as terms when they're talking about space. Okay, so in the 2010 standard, we've added quite a bit of information. So one of the things that was a huge issue with the 96 standard is that storage space was called out basically the same as office space in a building. So if you have storage space on your parking levels in a building, it would be designated the same as a usable tenant space. And the problem with that is that that has load factor then. So all of your load factor for the building is now going to basically the cheapest part of the building. So one of the things that happened in the 2010 standard is occupant storage showed up as part of the standard, and now that is not allocated with a load factor in the building. Another thing that happened in the 2010 standard is that we added method B as an option for calculating square footage. So method B basically means that you have one load factor for the building. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail later, but it's a nice option if you don't want to track exactly what's happening on every floor. So this is a handy dandy comparison of the terms used in the two standards that we're looking at now. Sorry. So a lot of them are the same, some of them slightly changed. And this is something as design professionals and folks who are talking about square footages, we have to deal with a lot. The 2010 standard expanded by almost double the size of the 1996 standard of measurement. So there were a lot more definitions. There were a lot more defined gray areas in the 2010 standard. A lot of people at this point usually asked or did ask at that in 2010 or following if it was worth them recalculating their building from a 96 calculation to a 2010. The answer for that is very often not. it didn't really add a lot of area to most buildings. It did add for a couple different types, but not to the level that the 2017 standard has. So that was a question that came up quite a bit in the industry in the early 2010s. And now we're dealing with it with the 2017. So that's actually exciting. So we'll get into that in a little bit. Things in the 2010 BOMA standard that were added. A lot of information about different building categories. So we're seeing a couple of them here. Restricted headroom still is listed as part of rentable area. It just has to be called out. So that's kind of what you're seeing here in the graphics off to the right-hand side. Void is a kind of a weird thing that happens in buildings that is actually taken out of the footage as a whole for the building. Connectors and vault space. So connectors were added. These are things that we see often in buildings. It depends on where the property line is at and how that space is used. So that's one of those things where we want to understand what the lease language is to see how we're going to allocate that. And then vault space, very often this is something involving a utility or a subsection of the building. So it's going to be a building service most often. And it could go outside of the actual building line, depending on where it is and what its function is. Okay, so method B, let's get to the next one. No. Method B basically was added in the 2010 standard. It still is in the 2017 standard. Some ownership groups decide to use this, and we'll get into it in more detail in a little bit later on in this presentation. But basically what it is you take all of the usable area in a building, all of the rentable area in a building, and you lump those two numbers together to get a load factor. So it gives you one load factor for the whole building. This was the first time this showed up in a standard. Okay, and then wall priority. So the 96 standard actually has no information really about wall priority other than they show graphics about where you should draw the lines for wall priority. This is the first time that this actually shows up in a standard, and this is delineating where you draw the lines between spaces. This can be a big question when we're going through a building and looking at how we're defining the space. If you change the delineation of a space, it can change the size of a space just because of the wall priority. So that's something that's important to talk through with clients as well as tenants. There are a lot of questions that come up about this. It can change the size of your building depending on if you have, you know, storage on certain floors or building service on lower levels, where that wall is. So we like to define this as early as we can, and we like to stick with it as much as possible so we don't change the size of a property. So method A, we haven't really talked about. This is referenced in the 2010 as well as the 2017 standard. This is basically legacy method. It's a 1996 calculation for the most part. You have different load factors by floor, depending on what's happening on the floor. And the calculation process is exactly the same as it would be for the 1996 standard. Okay, so this is things that were added in the 2010 method A versus method B comparison. So like I said, the method A is very closely related to the 1996. It's the most often used in most markets. Method B allows for a single load factor for the entire building. We'll get into how that actually happens a little bit later on in this. But basically, what's going to happen if you're calculating a method B is that you put a pretend corridor on every floor to normalize the load factor for the building. So It's great in that it's flexible for people to use, and you have one load factor for a whole property. Downsides can be that tenant groups have a lot of questions about that load allocation, and it's a little bit less precise floor by floor. All right, before I go into 2017, are there any questions so far?
There are no questions in the chat yet.
Okay, good deal. Okay, so I said previously that between the 1996 and the 2010, a lot of ownership groups asked us if there was a reason for them to recalculate. Sometimes there is. The 2010 standard allowed for a little bit more exterior area on retail floors to be included. But in large, there wasn't a major reason to recalculate a property. There wasn't a large square footage gain potential. That's not the case with the 2017. So I work both with ownership groups as well as tenant groups on portfolios across the country. And my answer to ownership groups on the 2017 standard is, it is in your best interest to get your buildings put in this standard as soon as you can. My answer for tenant groups across the country is, if you can sign a 2010 lease, do it. So this, we're going to get into this in detail, but this is the most significant change that we've seen in the last 20 years on a square footage standard. So why would we care about this? What happens is there are areas that are included in a property. Everybody talks a lot about exterior spaces that are now included, being roof decks and balconies, etc. There's another thing that happens in buildings now that most people are not aware of, which is that major vertical penetration inclusion is happening in the standard. So almost every building is larger in a 2017 standard versus a 2010 standard. So there are other changes that happen in the 2017 standard. One of the things within this that's really a core of the change for the standard as a whole is that there is integration with IPMS standards that is international. So a lot of times when we're talking to folks about lease language and how common BOMA square footages are, like we talked about earlier, it is optional to include this standard, but it's also mutually agreed upon by a whole bunch of people. So with that, IPMS is, as you can see, 56 member groups internationally agreeing on where they're going to draw the lines for a space and how they're terming the different spaces that will show up in a lease. So with that, we have slightly different terms and slightly different line delineations in the 2017 standard. So IPMS 1 is roughly equated to gross building area or exterior gross area or constructed gross area. It goes to the outside line of the building and includes everything inside of the building. IPMS 2 is closest approximated to interior gross area or gross measured area. So that goes to the inside face of enclosing walls and glass line on buildings. And then IPMS 3 is, this is where we have a new term, it's tenant area. So we're gonna get into this a little bit later, but the 2017 standard has tenant area, tenant ancillary area, occupant area, which is basically usable square footage, and then rentable area. So it breaks down quite a bit, but the main point is that this tends to be what is exactly included in a tenant space without allocated access to the space. So that was a major change in the 2017. Okay, so new things that are included in rentable area. We now can include balconies, which is great. In a lot of markets, this is something that tenants have always wanted to have in the building. Ownership groups have provided them and not charged for them because anything exterior on an upper floor was not allowed to be included on the 2010 or the 96 BOMA. So that it's now included in the 2017, which is a big deal. And then covered galleries are something that's included in the measured area of a building. It's actually excluded from the rentable area, but it is measured and it's something that you can express to tenants as an amenity for the property. So rooftop terraces, any kind of amenity on a rooftop can now be included. So one of the things that is happening quite a bit in several markets is that we're looking at how we can improve rooftops for tenant use. This doesn't need to be a deck. It could be anything that's included, anything that's improved for tenant use that tenants have access to. So it could be a racing track. It could be a patch of grass. Look, there's a lot of options there. And then this is kind of the biggest deal and the sneakiest part of the 2017 standard is that the bottom of major vertical penetrations are now included in rentable area for the building. So this used to be fully excluded. These would be things like the bottom of a stairwell, the bottom of a elevator shaft. You can also see here, there's a slight change to the stair access. It used to be anything inside of a rated enclosure for stair access was shown as the stair. So what you're seeing to the right of the plan is all of the stuff that is either blue or pink used to be yellow. So it used to be excluded and it now is included in office area. Okay, 2017 standard. Citing the actual standard is important. This is something that was listed in the 2010 standard. It was a little bit hard to find. It's kind of in the intro, and it's not called out very specifically. But if you're citing a BOMA standard in a lease, you need to fully cite what standard you're using, including method A or method B. So that's always something to look for. Like I said, in the 2010 standard, it was pretty well buried. So it was sometimes used and sometimes not used. In the 2017 standard, this text that you're seeing to the left is actually from the book. So there is a giant exclamation point with an important next to it, and it says, please use the full citation of it. What you're seeing to the left here is, or sorry, to the right, is that with the 2017 standard, we also have more definition about how we're drawing our lines. So this has kind of evolved as the standards have evolved because everybody always has questions. So what you're seeing on the far right is a comprehensive listing of all of the things that can happen with a column or a wall on an exterior surface. There are a lot more graphics in the 2017 standard to try to remove the gray area of how we're delineating the space as well as how we are calling out the space. So we'll see that as we go on. And of course, this seems like it's completely comprehensive, but I've already run into a problem where there is a exterior column issue that is not covered in there. So it's work in progress. We're working on it. Okay, so something new that was added in the 2017 standard is interbuilding area. This is really exciting for us folks who are dealing with leasing in property. This is a way that we can more appropriately allocate common areas. So it can be between buildings. It can also be on specific floors of a property. So where we see this most often is, like you see on the left-hand side, shared amenities between a couple of buildings. This could be in a joined building or in a park. We used to have to manually calculate things like common area, fitness centers, conference centers, that kind of thing in an office park. Now there is an expanded spreadsheet where we can include interbuilding area and allocate those specifically to the appropriate parties that have access to it in lease language. And then the other part of this is between floors. So we see this a lot in properties where we may have a major tenant taking the office area of a floor and a retail group that is on the lower part of a building and may not have access to several amenities in there. If the amenities are open only to the office group, they can now be allocated only to the office group, which is new. Okay, door setbacks. This is the biggest ground floor change in the 2017 standard. So in the 2010 standard and the 96 standard, we used to be able to go further outside the building on a lower floor with retail access that is on a public thoroughfare. So if you're walking down the street and you're going to a building, in the 2010 standard, you can go to an imaginary line that is to the building above. And if you have external circulation, you can include that. In the 2017 standard, you can still include external circulation. If you have something like a strip mall with tenant access, that's still allowed to be included, but the retail line as a whole moves back a little bit in the building. And one of the things that's important to note here is the graphic on the side, we're seeing, we're measuring door space. And if the door space, like you see, is less than 50% of the width, you go to the inside face of the door. If it's more than 50% of the width, you go to the you ignore the setbacks. So one of the things that's important to note here is that it just says doors. It doesn't say code required doors. So if we're looking at the left-hand graphic, the bottom one, if we have an 8-foot wide setback there, if that was a double door, if it was a 6-foot wide door, we would ignore that setback. So it's an important thing to note when you're developing properties, what's going on with the doors and how we can allocate those spaces, because if that was a double door, you'd get that whole vestibule area back, basically, that setback. So there's a vertical graphic here as well. A couple of vertical terms are better defined in the 2017 standard. One of them is where the boundary area falls for retail spaces. Another one's going to be a set height limit for figuring out your dominant portion of space. Okay, interior door setbacks. So this is also a change. 2010 and 96 have minimum corridors, so this is only code required corridors. The 2017 has a much better defined system for outlining what is a corridor and what is a tenant ancillary area. Those are the areas we're seeing on the right-hand graphic as setbacks specifically done for a tenant space. The difference between exterior and interior setback requirements is that exterior only talks about doors. Interior includes doors and adjacent relights. So if you have a lot of glass going into a space, you're more likely to ignore the setback. If you don't, you would exclude the setback. Okay, spreadsheets. So these are all three spreadsheets that you'd likely see right now for square footages. I'm going to start with the 96 again, because this is what a lot of people still use as terms when they're talking about square footages. So your gross measured area becomes your interior gross area in the 2010, and then your boundary area in 2017. People still call that gross measured area. It's basically the inside measured area of a building for the most part. It's a good thing that that term changed, because gross measured area in the gross measurement standard actually goes to the outside line of the building, and it's not an interior line. So the definition between the 96 and the 2010 was helpful. And it's just kind of analogous in the 2017. It's just sort of there as a term. This is not something that's actually used in leasing at all, because it still includes major vertical penetrations. So it's the number that we start with in a property, but it's not something that will ever show up on a lease. Okay, the next one that we're going to look at is floor rentable area in the 96. So this is the number that will match your final number for the building. So this is your measured line for the building minus non-rentable areas, as we're going through the various different spreadsheets. So non-rentable area in the 96 standard is elevator shafts, stairways, etc. You can see in the 2010 standard that's expanded. So that's where we've added occupant storage, parking, which is measured but not included now, as well as major vertical penetrations. And then 2017 includes all of those same categories, but they've been consolidated into rentable exclusions. So in a 2017 calculation, columns C, D, and E from the 2010 would be all listed in the rentable exclusions column. Usable office area. People still use this term a whole lot. So usable office area is the space kind of within a tenant space. This is the area that's fully allocated to the tenant. In the 96 standard, that includes a tenant space as well as maybe a dedicated entry or hallway extension that goes to that tenant. In the 2010 standard, this term is changed to occupant area. And then in the 2017 standard, it's three different terms. So tenant area, which is the interior tenant space, tenant ancillary area, which is hallway extensions, door setbacks, balconies that are dedicated to tenants. All of those are included, and then tenant area plus ancillary together equal occupant area. So same as the 2017 standard, or the 2010 standard, sorry. The biggest thing to look at on this spreadsheet that is confusing for a lot of folks is that towards the end of the spreadsheet here, we have had a switch over time on where the rentable area is listed and where the load factor for the building is listed. So in the 96, the load factor for the property by floor is all the way at the end of the spreadsheet. And right next to that is the rentable square footage. In the 2010 standard, that was reversed. So the rentable area was all the way at the end of the spreadsheet. Load factor was right next to that. It actually caused quite a bit of problems for people, because I think the load factor being right next to a preliminary load factor, which is the RO ratio, was very confusing for people. So they changed it back in 2017. So now the load factor again is at the end of the spreadsheet, and your rentable is right next to that. So if you're looking for stuff on a spreadsheet, this is where you should look. Okay, so this is just a comparison of the different overall calculation of a property. So terms have changed over time. like we talked about. The 96 is termed as gross measured area. The 2010 is IGA, interior gross area, and the 2017 is boundary area. Most often across the country, the term that's used right now for all of these is IGA. It's still from the 2010 standard, but any of those could be termed the same thing. One of the things that also changed in the 2017 standard that's important to note is a height restriction for dominant portion. So it used to be in the 2010 and 96 standard that if you have, say you have a 20-foot high space and you have 15-foot high windows that start at your ceiling, you would get credit for that in the older standards. Now they've delineated an 8-foot high stop to where we're figuring out the dominant portion, and that's for human skill kinds of things. Something that's above a certain height doesn't benefit people at eye level. So this is a little bit coordinating with green standards and with kind of usability of properties. So that 8-foot high line now is stopping, even if you have a space that's much higher than 8 feet, we're measuring from 8 feet down to figure out what the dominant portion of a space is. So that's what we're seeing here. Like I said, there are quite a bit more delineations in the 2017 standard explaining how we figure out the dominant portion of a space. This is also where we're going to have the most discussion on leasing, because you can draw the line wherever you feel like sometimes. Okay, so here we just have a comparison of method A versus method B. Most of the terms are the same all the way down here. It's just that method B will have base building circulation. That term only happens in that standard, and that's basically the corridor that I was talking about, where if we're working in a building, whether or not you have a single tenant or a multi-tenant floor, you're drawing a minimum corridor in to establish a consistent load factor. So while priority in the 2017 standard is much better defined, there are several graphics that explain where to draw the lines for spaces. So we're hoping to get into less arguments about how things have been calculated. Okay, this is also, this is helpful. So the 96 versus 2010, we're gonna get into 2017 in a second. There are definitions in the 96, there's no graphic and there's no hierarchy for where we're putting the line between walls. So it could be inside face, outside face, or center line are your options. In the 96, there are graphics that show that, but there's not an established exact, this is where you draw the line kind of thing. So they added that in the 2010 standard, as you can see here. They call it near side, far side, and center line. That's what NS, FS, and CL are standing for in this graphic on the side here. But this was definitely helpful for everybody. But even better in the 2017 standard is we have these. So this is not anything involving us needing to look at a graph. This is every space with every adjacent space potential and showing where the line goes between those spaces. And they do these for all of the different spaces in the 2017 standard. So it should be very clear where the lines are drawn between spaces. Again, base building circulation is a term you would only see in a method B calculation. So another thing that's defined in the 2017 standard, which is an additional 50 pages on top of the 2010 10 standard is all of these special considerations. So we could have mezzanines, we could have voids, we could have connectors, we could have restricted headroom. Some of these are in the 2010 standard, most of them are not. So this is additional information that we got in the newer standard. And then this is a quick check informational for a spreadsheet. So if you're looking at a square footage calculation for a property, very often people will do a method A and a method B, both, just to see how the load factor varies per building, and what they want to use for the property. So regardless of that, method A or method B is not going to change the overall rentable square footage of your building. They're always the same. It's just going to change the load factor by floor. So if you're looking at the space within your property, the column D on the current spreadsheet, which is your floor rentable area total, should match your rentable area for the property. And that's not going to change between the two. So if you're talking about leasing in a property, these tend to be the columns in a spreadsheet that people focus on. In the 2017 standard, column E is your tenant delineation. It's important to note, if you're talking about usable square footage, to not use the tenant area, which is column F. That sometimes doesn't include ancillary areas, which is column G. So column H is actually your usable square footage equivalent in a 2017 standard. The other columns that are most often referenced are your rentable square footage and your load factor, which are columns Q and R that we can see here. And then again, your overall rentable square footage for the property is going to be in your building totals all the way down to the bottom in column Q. Okay, so citing in a lease. This is something that we talked about a little bit earlier, and it has been more and more emphasized in the various BOMA standards. You're not required to use the BOMA standard, but if you do and you want to cite it in a lease, you need to make sure that you cite it correctly. So we want to list the information for the building, as well as the full, as we can see on the bottom right-hand side here, the full listing of which standard you used, which year it was issued. The ANSI BOMA Z65.1 is the same number for 2010 and 2017. So you need to list whether it's 2010 or 2017. And then you also want to list whether it's method A or method B. It's always good to include an option for folks to do their own measurement or come back with another party and decide what's going on in the space. So that's included here, but that's really up to anyone to use or not use. All right. That was my 50-minute tirade on square footages. So anybody have any questions?
I love it. It was very informational. Does anybody have any questions about specifics related to this? No? You got nothing? That was a lot of information, Kelly.
It's a lot. It's a lot of information.
It is, and I'm sure you boiled down what is actually a much longer presentation of all of the changes and information for us today.
It's very true. There are also things to consider if you're looking at a property that aren't listed in this presentation, which are planability considerations. So very often we work with tenant groups as well as ownership groups in looking at a property for planability in addition to actual BOMA square footages. So it's always good, like those door setbacks, like including exterior or not including exterior spaces, to work with an architect in looking at what's happening in a building, so you can really maximize it. the cost to do some of these improvements or move a door or add a door are very minor compared to the lease gain potential for a lot of this stuff. But the other part of that is planability for different sorts of office spaces. So looking at your window mullion spacing, looking at your bay depth that's in a property, you know, looking at what your minimum corridor to get to your 2 required exits on a floor and your stairwell and your bathrooms. These are things that seem minor to some people, but will make the difference sometimes between hitting a market load factor that is appropriate and planability that will be very efficient for tenants, or something that is outside market standard and needs to be capped. So it's a good thing to think about.
Thank you. I appreciate you so much coming on and joining us. If we don't have any more questions.
Actually, I do. Hi, this is Christina Tracy.
Hi, Christina.
Kelly, I have a question. So if you have tenant spaces at the end of a corridor and you happen to have maybe 2 or 3 doors that are by each other, how do you calculate the ancillary area? Who takes on that space?
So what we try to do is make that so that the footage is going to change a lot, right? So the corridor extension obviously is lopped off of the floor common because it's only for some tenants on the floor. The best case scenario would be that someone takes the overall square footage of whatever tenants have access to that corridor and then divides up the corridor appropriately by square footage. What you're going to want to do also is make sure if you have a tenancy, you have a large tenant that has 1 back door and 1 front door, and the back door is off of your corridor extension, you would want to take the overall footage of the tenant divided by number of doors and access to that corridor. So if they have 2 other doors and that one, you would charge 1/3 of that overall footage to the corridor. If they have 2, you'd charge half, etc.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
And in regards to janitorial services, you know, since you can identify usable and rentable, how would you separate the square footage for those common areas?
So janitorial services, that's up to lease language. A lot of the stuff in a BOMA square footage really defaults to the lease. So it is the intended use and maintenance of a space. There is a sidebar to that where questions come up a lot when we talk about these things, where you might have like a building management office, or you might have something that's an amenity space like a conference room or a fitness center in a property. It's really up to the ownership group to decide how they want to charge that. If you can list it as a building service or building amenity, either of those spaces. And that would obviously allocate the footage out to all tenants in the building. What sometimes will also be a preferred method is to list that as a usable square footage, which will then have an applied load factor, and then you can charge out to tenants directly for that space that have access to it. Or in the case of a building management office, charge the whole building. But what that accomplishes is that if someone moves into the building management office or the fitness center or the conference center, your overall load factor for the building doesn't change, because that has been listed as usable square footage and not a building amenity, which is allocated to a load factor.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
This is fascinating to me because this is not what I do. So I love hearing about it. Fantastic. Thank you. Does anybody else have questions? No? Okay. Thank you so much, Christina, for asking your question. Thank you, Kelly, for joining us. Appreciate you so much. Everybody have a wonderful day, and let me know if you need anything.